The Y Curve with Phil Dobby and Roger Hearing.
The campaign's underway.
Lots of promises.
Building more surgeries, signing up more soldiers, free social care, reviving small towns.
But how much will it all cost, and where will the money come from?
All fully costed, they say, paid for by stopping tax avoidance, efficiency savings, ending non-dom status, putting VAT on school fees.
But how realistic is this? How much room is there really for spending?
On the morning after the election, when the new Chancellor enters the Treasury and the books are opened, what will they find?
The Y Curve.
Well, the note that they may find. So it was Liam Byrne.
Yeah, 2010.
He was the Chief Secretary to the Treasurer. So yeah, at the end of the last Labour government, saying, "Dear Chief Secretary, I'm afraid there's no money left." Read by David Laws, who was the Liberal Democrat MP who succeeded him in that coalition government.
That has echoed down the ears ever since. But that's the problem. I mean, what on earth actually is there? Because, we get told publicly, of course, what's various ideas. But if you actually look at the books...
Yeah.
What's the prospect?
Well, we know the top line number, though. So we know back then, if you look at government debt to GDP ratio, back then it was a little below 71%. Last year, it was 97.6%. So if there wasn't any money left then, well, where are we now? Even before the pandemic, it had got up to 85%. So from 71 to 85. And then obviously just got hit by the pandemic. And no one can deny the government had no choice but to react to the
But we've
pandemic.
discussed on this show before, we talked about the fact that, government can effectively create money. They can do that. They can do what they need to do. But obviously it has downsides.
Yeah. And the issue is this time around, I mean, everyone is saying, well, no, we don't want to do that. We want to be fiscally conservative, both sides of politics. So can you do that? Because we've seen what the effect was. I mean, those years of trying to get government spending down actually didn't work because government spending still went up.
And they made everyone miserable into the bargain.
Well, exactly. We saw the effect on growth. So real net domestic product per capita, which is so that's like GDP, more or less another measure of GDP, but and it's real, so it's adjusted for inflation per capita. So we get, this is I think is the real measure of how well off we are.
Come on, you're teasing us. What's the number?
Well, since 2010, it has grown by 9.5%. So over 14 years, so a little under 0.7% growth per year. That's how slow. That's how stagnant the economy has been. So if we want to, so I feel like the only way you can get out of this is to grow your way out of it.
Right, because you get more tax with the same thing because of the amount of money. But
to do that, you've got to spend the money to get the growth.
Yeah,
they're not saying that.
They're not saying that. They say, how are you going to get? Oh, I know. Well, VAT on school fees. Well, that'll do something, but not much. Yeah. They're saying, end non-dom status. Well, again,
it does feel all a bit like tinkering at the edges and all the stuff which
efficiencies. we can have efficiencies.
Yeah, we've only thought of that before. Well, maybe we should have done that last time.
It's ridiculous.
So,
I mean, all these things aren't really going to make much difference.
It's not a big idea, is it? There's no big idea. In this election
if you're not going to raise that much money from any of these things, all the promises you're making, so much hot air.
Yeah. So it does feel like we're going to be stuck in this stagnant economy for another term of government, and where's the change going to come from? Because and as I was saying last time, it depends on whether you're a Keynesian economist.
No, it was Milton Keynes, who had this amazing profile, which very few of us have heard of him.
So good they named a town after him. But I mean, the whole Keynes approach obviously was the government should invest for growth. But we've got lost in the Friedman approach, which is it's let's try and control the money supply, and if you control the money supply, can you really get growth? It's
one of the central questions which we don't know the answer to. But let's talk to someone who knows about all this. Michael Nauer is Assistant Professor of Economics at Durham University, and he joins us now.
So, Michael, just how bad do you think the situation is, really? Because, I mean, we were talking just before we started, you came on about, what the last government inherited in terms of how much debt there was as a proportion of GDP. It is that much worse now. So, but can you get too hung up about that? Because obviously there are parts of the world where the debt to GDP ratio is worse than it is in the UK. So do we sort of step back and go, oh my goodness, we've got to stop spending? Or do we say, well, no, if the economy's going to grow, then there's got to be some sort of investment. Perhaps we need to spend a bit more.
So one of the key reasons why other countries are perhaps better able to cope with their high debt to GDP ratios is the interest that they pay on that debt. So one of the key issues that whatever government comes in will face is the sheer amount of government revenue that they're going to have to spend on paying off the debt. And this is far higher than it was when the at the time of the last significant government change back in 2010, simply because the nature of UK government debt has changed quite a bit in that time. In particular, for very good reasons, in the era of low inflation, the UK government chose to increase the amount of their debt that was index linked, so paid relative to the rate of inflation. And of course, that meant in an era of low inflation, they could reduce their interest payments down, spend less of their revenue on paying off their debt. But of course, given what's happened over the last couple of years, this has meant that the amount of money that's been spent on repaying the debt has increased dramatically. I mean, over the last year, it peaked at around 10% of all of the money that the government was spending was simply spent on repaying their debts. And at least in the medium term, that number, yes, it's going to come down, but it's not going to come down that much.
So this is index-linked bonds that they issued. So
exactly.
Out of a proportion of all the bonds they're issuing, then what proportion were index-linked? It seems, I mean, in hindsight, it's very easy to say, well, that was a bad idea, wasn't it? But
well, they do what they need to do at the time, don't they?
Exactly. And I mean, the key benefit of these index-linked bonds, of course, was that they faced a lower baseline interest rate than the non-index linked bonds, because the index linking was meant to provide an added benefit on top. And I mean, it worked very well for the early 2010s. They were able to keep interest payments relatively low compared to the size of the debt. But then, of course, we have the inflation spike coming through, and the interest payments rose to match.
Yeah, because what we're dealing with is, I mean, we should put the historical context. Of course, the 2010s were dealing with the aftermath of the economic semi-collapse almost, and the consequences of that. And then, of course, we had the COVID period after that, all of which were those kind of tides or winds that drove the economic fortunes. And now we're moving into a position after all that, hopefully. So are things settling down in a way that will make that easier for things like government debt, or worse?
So, it depends if we're talking the long run versus the short run. I mean, over the next year or so, you've still got inflation that is persistent. Yes, it's coming back down to target, but there are expectations for it to tick up again in the next year or so, possibly peaking around 3%. Again, index-linked debt relative to that. But at the flip side, in 2010, they had the benefit of the non-index linked debt. So those parts that they weren't paying relative to the rate of inflation, they were borrowing in an era of much lower interest rates. So Bank of England base rate was close to zero, has been close to zero since that period of time. Whereas, of course, now it's up above 5%, and it's predicted to stay that high. So yes, the index linked story may be getting a bit better, but then the non-index linked story far less optimistic than it was in 2010.
Can we get a bit carried away worrying about this debt, though? And I know, there's the rationale that this is debt which, we are placing on our children because they're the ones
and their children probably,
and because they're the ones who are going to have to pay it back. You can, of course, just issue more bonds to cover the money that you're having to spend on bonds. And ultimately, if it's owned by the central bank, I mean, that's another factor of government. And that's what's happened it's since the pandemic, isn't it? The central bank basically has been buying up a lot of these bonds. So it's sort of like one arm of the government paying interest or not needing to pay interest because it's government money, whichever way you look at it.
So does the debt really matter, I suppose, is the point.
So it would matter a lot less if the two key parties hadn't made the promises that they've made, particularly as far as government income and government revenue is concerned. So if they had not made promises to not change income tax, to not change VAT, to not change national insurance, to not change corporation tax, then we could perhaps be far less concerned about the debt because they'd have more flexibility to temporarily increase taxation of one kind or another, pay it off, get it back down to more manageable proportions of government expenditure, and then reduce the taxation to match.
But that's one thing. I mean, the question I was sort of clumsily asking was, if the money moves onto the balance sheet at the central bank and just sits there? I mean, what's to stop it sitting there for a long time?
So that worked in the era of low interest rates, and in particular in the era of quantitative easing. But given the challenges that the Bank of England's faced over the last few years, they're unwinding that. So we're now moving into an era of quantitative tightening, where they're trying to effectively offload some of this debt. So the scope for the Bank of England to take on board the increases in debt is going to be reducing, because they need to be using quantitative tightening alongside interest rates to fight inflation.
So the reasoning behind that is, just to explain the logic behind that, though, the reason why they need to take bonds that they've bought and put it back on the open market. What's the rationale? What's the reasoning behind quantitative tightening?
So it's because in the era of quantitative easing, they couldn't do much with interest rates. They were at or close to zero, at or close to the lower bound. So the main tool that they had in order to, at the time, promote inflation, get it back up to target, was quantitative easing. But we're in a very different world now. We're in a world where, no, they can't afford to be carrying out vast quantities of quantitative easing because of the potential impact on inflation. If they carried out as much quantitative easing as they did in the early 2010s, then not only would inflation not be reducing down to target, but if anything, it could be back on an upwards trajectory. So yes, they've got more scope to use interest rates as a tool to fight inflation, but they can't have one part of their activities on the quantitative easing, quantitative tightening side of things fighting against the other in the form of interest rates.
So the quantitative easing was putting more money into the economy. So that was the inflation risk. Is that right?
Exactly. So quantitative easing, the theory went that you put more money into the economy, you stimulate demand, and therefore stimulate inflation, because the Bank of England's target is two-sided. So it's considered to be just as much of a failure if inflation drops too far below target for the Bank of England as it is if it goes too far above target, which is not the same in other parts of the world.
So quantitative tightening is going to take money out of the economy then, at a time when presumably we want to say, well, we want to grow ourselves out of the situation we're in right now rather than just face more stagnation. So wouldn't quantitative tightening right now just make the stuff worse?
In terms of the prospects for economic growth, absolutely. But we could make the same argument about interest rates increasing as far as they did and acting as a dampener on growth. But the ultimate aim of the Bank of England, their primary objective, is to fight inflation. And once they've managed that, then their secondary objective is to promote growth and promote economic activity. But their primary objective is focused on inflation. So until they get that back under control and back to target in a sustainable fashion, using their terminology, they can't be seen to be pursuing policies that run counter to that objective.
All right, so that's the kind of the macroeconomic position as we go in, as say, imagine the new Chancellor going in on July the 5th and looking at things. What we're saying is, in terms of spending more, in having effectively increasing government debt, is not a good prospect, as we said. And as you say, the parties have nailed their colours to the wall in terms of not increasing income tax, not increasing VAT, and various other things. So is there actually much wiggle room there, things that can be done in terms of the nation's finances to meet any of the kind of commitments that they've talked about?
I mean, on the taxation side, pretty much no. It's the promises on those big four, that accounts for 70% of the money that's coming into the government. So unless they want to stick up the other 30% dramatically, even more dramatically than has happened in the past, there's very little they can do on the income side. So unless they want to increase fuel duty, alcohol duty, tobacco duty, things like that to unprecedented levels, it's not going to be enough to compensate for what they've effectively given up on their promises on income tax, NI, VAT and corporation tax.
So they can't do anything on the income side, they can't do anything in terms of increasing their expenditure and growing their debt, because that could be, well, that would just add to the situation where we are now, but also could be inflationary if it's putting even more money into the economy. They're between a rock and a hard place, aren't they?
Exactly. And even on the expenditure side, again, some of the promises they've made are going to be very costly. So the triple lock on pensions in particular, it's if you look at the amount of money that's spent on the pensions, it's around 20 odd % of the amount of money the government spends is on the state pension. So by maintaining the triple lock on that, maintaining the increase, and as the Conservatives have committed to then increasing the thresholds to match, that's a significant portion of government expenditure, which again, they've promised to do nothing to. And you combine that with what they've said on defence expenditure, which again is a big chunk of expenditure. It means that pretty much the only thing they can do is cut everything else very significantly indeed.
But Michael, one of the things they've been pushing quite hard is ways in which what we've got can work better. So, they talk about efficiencies within the public finances and within the civil service, within services. But also they talk about pulling back on tax avoidance, for example. Is any of that, assuming whatever base level we imagine can come out of it, of any significance in addressing public finances?
So, yes and no, particularly on the efficiencies in the public sector. So in terms of GDP, yes, if they're able to achieve large increases in efficiency, then that will increase GDP. But in terms of the actual tax take, it entirely depends what they then do as far as the size of government is concerned, because they can do one of two things. They can either keep the government the same size, employ just as many people, but have them doing more things, having a better, bigger government, or they can take those efficiencies and use them to cut the size of the government employment share. And the issue with the second of those is, where do those people then go? Are there the opportunities for them to move into the private sector? Is the private sector going to be able to pick up that employment slack? And again, if you look at what's happening in terms of vacancies in the short run, the answer is still probably no. Longer term, yes, far more cause for optimism, but short term, far less scope for them to pick up any of those workers that the government does want to cut as a result of these big efficiencies.
So they join the unemployed, they get the benefits associated. So in effect, they are taking money out of the system rather than, or in some way, balancing the fact that they're no longer being an expense on the government's balance sheet.
Exactly. And of course, all of those people employed in the civil service, they're all going to be paying income tax. They're all going to be paying national insurance, which of course will go away if they exit the labour force.
So, Michael, what's going wrong? Because, if we go back a couple of decades, we seem to be better off. We didn't have, austerity. We didn't have the long National Health Service waiting lists. We didn't have as many potholes in our roads. There's more cars on the roads. I guess that might be part of the reason to do that. And some of them are heavy electric cars. But, why are we not able to even cover the basics now, and yet we seem to be getting deeper and deeper into debt? What's changed?
So the big thing that's changed is productivity in the UK. So simply the amount of output that we're producing per worker. So prior to the financial crisis, that was improving very comfortably. We had rising productivity, high levels of investment, but then during the financial crisis, it collapsed and it simply has never recovered. Productivity growth post-crisis, so post-2008, has never been sustainably as high as it was pre-crisis. And
So what happened? Why?
Well, there's a huge number of explanations out there. One of the big ones is collapsing investment. So if we look at the amount that companies are investing into machines, investing into capital of one kind or another, it fell after the financial crisis and it's never really recovered to the same level as it was before. And one of the key ways we can make workers more productive is to give them the machines to do so. But if companies aren't investing, then that investment simply isn't there, particularly if it's then not coming from the government, which, of course, in the era of austerity, post 2010, it wasn't coming from the government either.
Well, there's so many services have slowed down. So if you're ill and you can't get seen to, then you're not going to be working. If you want to get the train into London from where we are, I'm guessing at one stage there's a 50-50 chance that you get there and back on time. Now, I'd say it's maybe 20% chance you won't get back at all. It's like, so it's hard to work efficiently because the infrastructure around you, whether it's at the corporate level, the company you're working for maybe not investing in the machinery, but also at the public level, that is holding people back, I think, isn't it?
Exactly. And one thing we've got to remember about investment is that you need to do a certain amount of investment on a rolling basis just to stay where you are, just to fight against the fact that things depreciate, that machines wear out, that infrastructure doesn't last forever. So if you're not meeting that lower level of investment, then, as you say, everything's going to deteriorate. And over the era of austerity, that level of baseline investment simply wasn't taking place. And we're seeing the results now in terms of, as you say, potholes and transport, etc.
So to summarize our problems, is it just that one word, austerity?
So austerity didn't help, but the evidence is mixed as to whether it was needed, because the issue is if austerity didn't happen, what would have happened to debt? Austerity happened, they were succeeding in getting the government debt pile down, in reducing the amount of government revenue spent on debt. And then COVID hit and everything fell backwards quite quickly. So the financial crisis, responding to that, was very expensive. It required a lot of government expenditure, which, of course, required a lot of borrowing. But again, this isn't to say that austerity is entirely to blame. If we look at what was happening to UK debt prior to the financial crisis, yes, it was decreasing, but perhaps not decreasing as fast as we would have ideally wanted, given the very favourable conditions in the wider economic situation at the time.
But isn't there a danger? So what we also saw that through that austerity, though, a number I gave just before we came on, if we looked at real net domestic product per capita over the last 14 years, it's grown basically a little under 0.7% growth per year. So a pretty stagnant economy for a long period of time. If we're forced into that situation where we have to have more austerity because we just can't borrow because the interest costs are too huge, we're just going to continue with a stagnant economy.
Well, this is the whole argument about investment in order to increase productivity, which is what you've been talking about, Michael. That you're in a vicious cycle of underinvestment and then under production as a result, and it just goes worse. So what about a virtuous circle? Is there an argument made for saying, yes, okay, the debt is what it is, but at least it's a way out of the crisis we're in? And that's clearly an argument being made on some political sides.
So it's certainly an argument that could be made, but the other side of the vicious cycle is effectively on taxation. So it's the theory of how much do we want to take short-term pain in order to get long-term gain? Because in order to invest, yes, we could borrow, but we could also effectively tax more now in order to grow the economy, have to tax less in the future. So with investment, it entirely depends on, well, how effective do we think this investment is going to be? If we think that the economy will grow fast enough that we'll be able to pay off the debt and reduce the debt as a proportion of GDP, then yes, that's the optimal way to go. But questions do arise. Well, how effective is this investment going to be? Is it just going to get us back to where we were, or is it going to push us beyond?
And but if you tax heavily as well, then people are spending less. So
and also it deters investment. A lot of people would say that private investment will simply not want to come here if the tax burden is too high for them. That's been a pretty standard Tory argument for a long time.
Or if the tax is high and there's ways of avoiding the tax, you're going to find those ways even if you stay in the country. So, for example, you could put more money into your pension scheme rather than spending it sort of day to day in the real economy.
Exactly, but that's depends on what we're taxing. Are we taxing effectively people consuming, or are we taxing people who are saving, or businesses that are saving? And if you look at some of the countries around the world that have grown quickest over the course of the last decade, they're ones where they save a much greater proportion of the pot of money of their GDP than we do. We have persistent low rates of saving in the UK. So taxation that's aimed at rebalancing that, at shifting things out of consumption and into savings, well, that's one way we could approach increasing investment.
Well, let's look at it in a slightly different way, Michael, because we sort of said, look, there's an enormous problem. There basically isn't. We're in a vicious cycle in terms of not having the means to do what we want to do. But on, as we said, July the 5th, the new Chancellor comes in and looks at what's there. Essentially, if there aren't the options, and there may be, but not many, of getting money from elsewhere, various things, what about reparceling out what's already there? Moving money between different jars, if you like, that might actually help things in the most active way. In terms of the economy, we know that money has to go to the NHS. We know that money has to go, in the current climate, potentially, I suppose, into defence, which has certainly been committed to. But where are the ways in which they could do that without actually damaging the economy?
So, again, there's very little scope for them to shuffle this around, given the promises that they've made, particularly, as I said before, on pensions. But there is scope for them to do it, but it would not be popular, and it would be potentially quite regressive, because one of the key areas of expenditure at the moment is on social protection. And if they really felt that it was important, they could shuffle money out of that, but that will hit the poorest in society far worse than it would other ways of shuffling things around. But again, the ways in which they can shuffle these expenditures around, it's limited given what they've already said in both of their campaigns.
So you talked about savings. If we could encourage people to save more, that means that there's more money for investment, and that would help businesses grow and help with our productivity. That only applies, of course, if that saving is invested in new initiatives or in growth. I mean, a lot of that saving just finds itself going into the share market or into housing, and it just pushes up asset prices without necessarily any productive growth. Is there a way that you can avoid that happening?
So this is focusing more on the taxation regimes for companies themselves. It's how do companies use any extra money that comes in? Because yes, we shuffle money into the stock market.
That's easy, Michael. Share buybacks.
Exactly. So the companies get the money, and it's then how do we encourage them to spend it on investment and not on share buybacks? And that's where the corporation tax regime plays far more of a role. The move to full discounting of investment. I mean, the issue at the time was it was only temporary in order to meet the fiscal rules. But if it was made longer term, then perhaps, yes, that would encourage companies to not engage in these, as you say, the share buybacks, but actually invest into the longer term.
But only if they thought there was no alternative. I mean, what's in that sort of situation, it's been widely claimed, people go to better tax regimes where they can.
Or more to the point, they feel as though the economy is growing enough that it's worth the investment. I mean, you can create a very healthy environment for businesses to invest, but if they think, well, hang on a second, people are not buying anything, that the economy has stagnated, there's just not the market for what we produce, in which case, they're going to be reticent, irrespective of how favourable the conditions are for them to invest.
Yes, absolutely. And this is where we start to look at the different types of companies, because we're not just a domestic economy. It's, yes, the domestic market is very important, but global markets also play a significant role, and it's how much scope is there for these companies to be more optimistic about their global prospects than perhaps their domestic prospects.
So here's the thing. I mean, it's a shame we're only touching on this sort of like as we get towards the end of the interview. But I mean, isn't that's the us and them, isn't it? In the global sphere, there's those countries that are net exporters, and then there's countries like the UK that are net importers. And I have not heard anybody talking about improving our exports during this campaign, and yet it seems like the direction you have to take, the focus has to be on growing by selling more goods or services overseas.
Yes, either selling more goods and services overseas, or one way or another reducing our dependence on imports, because imports, of course, are the flip side of the equation. Every piece of furniture that we import is something that's not being produced here and being sold here. And imports, of course, taken away from everything else when we're calculating GDP. So,
on the other hand, the pound has been rising quite a lot in the background of all this, which obviously doesn't help with exports, but, makes our imports cheaper. I mean, in a way, these kind of international tides could actually lift us to a point where things are better.
Yeah, but that fluctuates, doesn't it? I mean, the pound...
No, it's been pretty consistent over the last 3 or 4 years now.
Yeah. It has, but it's always a question of, well, how much of that is driven by temporary versus permanent changes. And, of course, if we look at the interest rate that the Bank of England has set compared to particularly the interest rate in Europe, we're far higher, which of course makes the UK far more attractive, pushing up the pound. But as that starts to hopefully unwind over the near future, will that act as a dampener on the value of the pound?
Exactly. I mean, it's bond markets, isn't it? I mean, if the Bank of England drops interest rates faster than the Fed does in the United States, watch the pound come down. But the idea that we earn more from exports, I mean, it's not the same as the government spending, but it is extra money coming into the economy, isn't it? And that's got to be, it is a way that the country can collectively get wealthier. So we have that investment for productivity. We just need to sell more stuff overseas.
And then all these promises the politicians make could be fulfilled.
And yet no one's talking about it.
Exactly. It's exports is one of the key areas where we have the potential, given the situation, for things to get better. But as you say, no one's really talking about it. It's very domestically focused as far as economic policy is concerned.
They haven't figured out yet what we can export.
Maybe not. Michael, just as we come towards the end of this, do you find when you hear politicians making the kind of promises we've been hearing, and you know what the figures are, do you just kind of wonder where they're living, what they're thinking about, or you hold your head in your hands? I mean, what's your feeling about this?
So, from an economic perspective, yes, I'm like, well, you're making all these promises for political reasons and very valid political reasons, but you're not being completely forthright about the trade-offs, and it does get frustrating sometimes when they aren't telling us very clearly what the downsides are in the way that they're so open about what the upsides are. Yes, no rise in income tax, national insurance, etc. But what is the trade-off? And I think we haven't, from my perspective, heard as much about the trade-off as we would like. But of course, anyone talking about the trade-offs is likely to happen what happened to Theresa May in 2017. So keeping stum makes for much better politics.
And do we get more productive if we become a more egalitarian society as well? I mean, is that something else that's not talked about a great deal? So we're promising all of this money for old age pensioners, some of them, not means assessed. Some of the, in fact, we're even saying we'll give you tax breaks that didn't exist before. And yet, a lot of these people don't need it. We have had, if you look at the Gini coefficient, it's been increasing. I think in the 80s.
This is the international measure of inequality.
It's how you measure, yeah. So if everyone's got the same, it's 1. If only one person has everything, it's 0. So you want to be as far away from 0 as possible to get to a more egalitarian society. In the 80s, we were 0.25. Now I think we're more like 0.35. France is on 0.3. America's on 0.4. but it's getting worse. Is the point? If we had a more egalitarian society, then perhaps money would be getting to the people who are more likely to spend rather than have money wrapped up in share portfolios that might not be that productive. That would be a good thing, wouldn't it?
So again, the detail is important. So one of the key things that's been happening to inequality in the UK is that it's been very focused at the very highest ends of the spectrum, so the very richest in society, whereas in other countries the inequality has been rising because of a burgeoning middle class at the expense of the poorest in society. And if we look at those people that are most likely to save in a way that is beneficial for investment, etc., it is those middle classes, whereas the very richest, they're internationally mobile. They just
buy another yacht.
Exactly. They buy another yacht. They offshore their wealth all around the world. So yes, the types of inequality that we have been seeing in the UK have been particularly damaging because it's been taking away from the poorest in society who prop up consumption. It's been taking away from the middle earners, who are the ones who are most likely to save for the benefit of the domestic economy, and funneling it towards the richest, who are far more likely to benefit other parts of the world than they are the UK.
So any money they address that through tax, and that's a tax issue, isn't it? But then we're not going to touch tax according to. So
it's a tax issue, but again, the issue with those high earners is they are internationally mobile. So is it better to get the amount of tax that we do at the rates that we charge, or to increase it at the risk of all of them moving to other parts of the world?
One of the central issues in the various promises that have been made.
Sounds like whichever party we have, they both face the same issues. They've got so little room to move. I wonder really what's going to change from early July onwards.
Exactly. And given the promises that both parties have made, the wiggle room that is the same on both sides. And
let's leave a note. Someone just leave a note. There is no wriggle room. Let's just pass it on.
That'll be the next one. Yeah. Michael, thank you so much for doing that for us. We shall see what wiggle room they do manage to find on July the 5th, I suppose, or thereafter.
Yeah. Good talk.
Thanks, Michael.
Great talking. Thank you.
So in short, I don't know. Have we got? Is anything going to change?
No, almost nothing.
Nothing.
But the point,
but at least we'll go and have an election. We'll have a lot of faith. It's a day out, isn't it? What a shame we don't do in
a day out.
Well,
what, you getting down to the polling station?
Well, do you know what? In Australia, there's always a sausage sizzle at the polling booth.
Yes, because they're forced to vote, aren't they?
You're forced to vote, and so everyone thinks, well, we may as well make the most out of it. There's always sausages there.
That's the important thing.
That's the important thing. Yeah.
But what, apart from sausages, actually helps a campaign? This is an interesting question. All the campaigns have been going on, all the sort of going to places with people with high-vis jackets on behind you and hard hats and making promises. I mean, does
sausage
it work?
Sizzles could actually be the answer.
Maybe it is. Yeah. What is it that works in a campaign? Is it TV debates?
Yeah.
Is it on social media, where, frankly, most of our leaders, I'm afraid, look a bit
the most successful campaigns have something to do with water. I just feel as though if you can appear at a water park,
or go on something and fall into the water.
I think early on,
a bit of Lib Dems there.
We've seen a bit of that. Yeah.
No, I mean,
but it's
what
just
is it?
Looking stupid.
Yes.
Does that help?
Well, maybe. Boris Johnson made a bit of a career out of it.
Yeah.
But look what happened to him. So,
he won
for a bit.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the thing. What is it that actually works? In fact, does anything work? How much of the dial is actually changed by the campaign?
I think the question is, isn't it? Is it important to get noticed, or do you have to tell people what they want to hear?
Yeah.
Or do you, dare I say, and this is a very risky approach, to actually tell people what you think they should know? So because otherwise, and if it's just telling people what they want to hear, it's lowest common denominator stuff, isn't it? Which is obviously why we've seen the return of Farage.
Well, indeed. And then there's the whole thing about manifestos. We get very excited when the manifestos are published, and who on earth, apart from even political journalists, they really sit down and read through the whole blessed thing?
Well, it's normally a complete work of fiction anyway, isn't it? No one believes them.
Exactly. So what is it that actually cuts through? And does anything, how much actually changes and what makes the difference?
Yeah, and how much of it is money? Does it? Is it the
paying
party
people to vote for you?
Well, you could be. Actually, it might be the most effective.
What are you?
Just on the companies, the parties that have got the most money to spend on promotion. Do they?
Well, of course, Reform
better?
Party is a company.
Interestingly so. Yeah. Well, maybe they'll win it. Maybe they'll start a whole new sphere of politics.
Anyway, we are going to.
But that's the question. Out of all of it, it's a question of what you do, but it's also how much money do you have behind you, and is that a key element of success?
What's the best way to spend it that actually makes a difference? difference.
Yeah. In other words, should the Tories actually just save the money for next time?
Yes, because look, vote whichever way you fancy. We're fine. And then do whatever. Well, we'll talk about all that next week.
Yeah, on the Why Curve. Join us for that. We'll see you then. Thanks for listening.
The Why Curve.